All right, Tim, why did the Fed kill the housing market?
Damn, man, you just got down to the root of the whole problem.
Yeah, let's just get into it, Tim. Why?
It's kind of insane when you think about what's happening in today's marketplace. I mean, the Fed came out basically and said we're going to stop the economic expansion of money, right? Isn't what they basically said? And the way they do that is raising rates. And what happens when you raise rates? Oof, right? It's
Well, yeah. I was looking at a Fed, what is this? A top economist, Mohammed El Irain. He said that the Fed may have destroyed the housing market by crushing both supply and demand. Top economist Mohammed El Irain says the Fed may have broken the U.S. housing market because interest rate hikes have helped drive up mortgage rates, weighing on supply and demand. So it was intentional.
it was intentional, but you have to go pre-pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pre-pandemic, things were becoming a little stale. Things weren't popping. We get the pandemic. A lot of people get sick. Everybody freaks out about the economy. The economy is going to tank. Nobody can work. And so what's the Fed do? They dropped interest rates. Just wham, brought it
But they had
all.
already been dropped, and this was like an ongoing conversation going back to 2008 where they dropped them to like 0. And historically they had sat at 5, right? That's like, go back like 20 years. And then during the economic crash of '08, they dropped it down to 0 in order to stimulate the economy, which it did.
Sure.
But then they never raised them back up again.
Well, they raised them slightly up, and then what happened was,
but they were at like 1%.
It was nothing, right? And then pandemic out, and then they slammed them back again, thinking that they had to, push a huge amount of cash into the marketplace, which is what you do when you lower rates. People went out and bought a lot of homes, and then the Feds realized, you know what? Not a good idea. What happened to prices of houses, Brian?
Well, prices were going up exponentially, but they were still affordable because of the rates. And here's where the danger was. It's sort of like it becomes a self-leveling, thing where people will buy the maximum they can afford, which, was twice as much as they can now. And I was watching people buy $600,000 houses for like $3,500 a month on the water. And, I was watching people buy $400,000 for $2,000 a month using government loans with like no money down.
Sure.
And it felt like that was a little bit out of control. So people kept pushing as far as they could based on those interest rates, but it wasn't based on a normal reality, being that the interest rates from the Fed were 5%. So I think that was a dangerous situation, because had it kept going, house prices would have gone into the point where they had become expensive again, but based on a 3% interest rate. And then you end up with what we have now, where rates go up to a higher normal amount, and then now houses are unaffordable because they're so expensive.
So the Fed at this point now is trying to crush the market so they can make houses more affordable again, right? That's what it comes down to.
Well, I think it had more to do with inflation than specifically the housing market.
It did. Now, I did hear, I love this, a conspiracy theory the other day, and they said that the other reason why they want to crush the housing market is to make people more dependent upon the government. The election's coming up, Brian. I'm just saying.
So when you're in economic distress, you look towards the government for help more, and you feel more dependent on the government.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
So it was a very neat theory. I was like, I don't know if I completely buy into it, because I think you are the master of your own destiny when ultimately, right?
Well, if they raise rates, from 3 to 7%, they're controlling your destiny as well.
They are. They're controlling the cost of housing, cost of rent, cost of living. Hell, the cost of getting a load of groceries in the grocery store, right?
Yeah. Well, there is an argument to be made that it worked, because we saw inflation hit 11%, and that's not sustainable, because then you'll end up with, what we're seeing now. Groceries are crazy expensive. The cost of goods, the cost of lumber to build houses got so out of control that it was too expensive to build new houses and they were charging a ton of money to build a house. So I feel like that, at least from what they were saying, that's what they did and why. And it also seemed like it worked.
And to a degree it did. Now here's the catch. The thought everybody's waiting for house prices to collapse, right?
Well, that's a different conversation. We can talk about that after. That will not happen. And it's simply, and this is why, if that was their goal, was to destroy the demand, they kind of did that, but they just destroyed the whole housing market, not just demand. Because the issue with the housing market is that there's no new construction being built.
No, but I see in this marketplace customers being resilient, Brian. I got to be honest with you. Even though the Fed's trying to crush it down, right? At the same time, I still got clients calling every day saying, "Listen, it's time for me to buy. I've got to own. I recognize the
No,
value of it."
and I think that people will, buy a house, and it's still affordable, in the big picture, in the sense that maybe you can't buy a 5,000 square foot house for $3,000 a month anymore, but you can still buy a 2,200 square foot house for $3,000 a month.
Exactly, and that's the key right there. I think it's also setting people's, perception of what they want to buy. Things are becoming a little bit more realistic. And then talk about houses as far as needing some tender loving care. I got people using renovation loans. I mean, they're going in saying, you know what, I'm going to take this house and restructure it so that it fits my needs, my wants, my desires. Makes sense.
Yes, but getting back to the Fed,
Yeah.
what is their like mid and long term goal? What are they saying that they're going to do?
Well, ultimately, what the Fed was looking to do was to retract the cash out of the marketplace, okay, because things were getting out of control. So they're pulling back on that horizon, and then what's going to happen is they'll begin reducing interest rates, which you and I both know relatively shortly. And
Maybe
yeah, they have to. They have no choice.
they do have a choice. I mean, they can choose not to. So, what is the Fed rate right now?
I don't know, is it five and a quarter, something like that?
So it's basically where it is historically.
Correct.
Now, the Fed rate, and maybe we can explain this a little bit, the Fed rate is not a direct correlation to mortgage interest rates. Mortgage interest rates are based on some sort of a 10-year projection because people don't live in their house for 30 years. So they sort of factor the profit margin built into a mortgage. And if they think that, even if, for instance, the Fed said, we're not going to raise rates for like 3 years,
Right.
I think that would cause interest rates to go down for mortgages, no?
So it's a little bit of a different twist. So think about the Fed's rates being the overnight rate that they lend to banks to
Yep.
cover the cash in the bank. Because when you give $100 and you deposit in a bank, the bank doesn't keep the $100, right? They turn around, they lend out 90 cents, I think 10 cents in the
96, right? Or is it 90? They lend out 96%, I
pretty
thought.
intense. Yeah.
Whatever it is.
So they're not keeping that cash in hand. The Federal Reserve, in essence, is their line of credit, if you will, to borrow what they need in order to replenish deposits and withdrawals. Now, here's the catch: we had a couple of banks lately that went under. Why? Because their investments were in treasuries, and the treasury rates were 1, 2, 3%. They had to borrow the money from the Feds at 5 and a quarter, so they're
Yeah.
paying more for their money than they're getting. Right.
Right.
So it's a loss, not a profit.
So in order for them to make money, they have to loan it out at higher than they're borrowing it, and they're borrowing it at 5, so they have to loan it out at 7 to make money.
Well, and so what are mortgages, right?
Well, they're 7, well, 6.5 now, but the mortgage companies make more than 6% interest because it's front-loaded interest. Like the first, 10 years you're paying the mortgage, the large chunk of that is the interest payment.
Right, and people don't recognize that. That's number one. Number two, they're also making money, and people don't think about this, on the escrows. I mean, there's a bunch of ways that people make money on mortgages. It's kind of wild.
So if interest rates, if the Fed held the rates, do you think that mortgage interest rates will go down? Because mortgage interest rates also follow like a stock market sort of thing where they're guessing what's going to happen in the future and they're projecting the market. It's not based on just flat numbers. It's based on the future. So if the Fed holds rates, will interest rates for mortgages go down, do you think?
So the answer is in the long term, yes. And the reason for that is because remember the Feds are lending the overnight rate based on the economy, right? So the Feds keep the rates at a certain level. The economy slows down. Ultimately, they're going to have to reduce their rates. If you look at the 10-year Treasury, the 10-year Treasury rate right now is like 3.8.
Okay, but you're saying that the Fed will have to lower rates. Why are you saying that? Because if the
Banks will go
historical
under.
Fed rate
The
is
banks will go
5%,
under. Yeah.
okay,
Right.
the banks can't maintain.
Yeah, because look, if the Fed continues to lend you money at 5, and you have investments you borrowed the money from the Fed at 3 or 2 because you invested in treasuries, you're taking a hit, dude. The Fed does not want to be owning banks. You understand that, right? That's what it comes down to. So they have to. They have no choice. They have to
So
reduce.
if they lower rates, what they're describing is that inflation will go back up. Is that what's going to happen?
Well, no, because they don't feel inflation will go up because they have basically reduced the economy to such a degree that it's just slowly plugging along, man.
Is it though?
People are struggling. Did you see the article about the amount of savings deplenishment that occurred in the last 6 months?
And the amount of credit card debt.
It skyrocketed. So
Yeah.
you tell me, you got to pay it back sometime, unless you're the Feds. But I mean, that's another story, right? So the key in a nutshell is the Fed does not want to be owning the banks. Number one, right? The Fed's whole job is to keep inflation down, and to keep the cost of goods down. Number two, the problem in a nutshell is once you've let the cat out of the bag, what happens with cost of items go up? Okay, ready for this one? Hourly wages go up. What's the minimum wage going to be in California in the next couple of years? $20 an hour.
Yeah, for sure.
So you're going to go to Wendy's or McDonald's when you order your food. There's not going to be a single person there, Brian. It's all going to be automated.
Well, there's not going to be a single value item left. Like that is another thing I do occasionally, have to go to one of these establishments. And I don't know if you remember the dollar menu. There is no such thing as a dollar menu any longer.
Oh, wow.
The 99-cent double cheeseburger is now $2.39. And, an average meal. I remember when I was first working, they came out with like the value meals that were $2.99. So you could get like the Big Mac or whatever, and it was all $2.99. Now it's like $10.50.
Yeah, dude.
And it's like you can now go to like a carryout restaurant and get like a really nice meal for the same price you can at a fast food restaurant.
Correct.
But so let's talk about the housing market. 'Cause ultimately, that's what people are tuning in for, is to understand the housing market. And will there be a crash? Will there be a scenario in which it's going to be easier? I would argue that the only scenario that makes things better, and only slightly better, is when rates go down. People will be able to afford more, but it does have a negative effect, which is house prices go up. Yeah. So what is the solution? And here's where I feel like the people are not talking about this. Tim, tell me if I'm wrong here. When the 2008 crash took place, most of the builders stopped building.
Correct.
After that, we had the millennials who historically start buying homes at 25 years old, chose not to buy homes until 32 years old. I remember a period of time where articles were coming out saying the millennials don't believe in owning things because they grew up, renting video games and renting everything. They rent Netflix. They don't buy movies anymore. It's like a ownership-less society, and that they like the freedom of not buying houses. Therefore, they're never going to buy houses. That's going to be a thing. And then they all had kids, and then they all wanted to buy houses. At the same time, interest rates dropped to 3%, and then that's what caused this like enormous boom. However, the builders never were able to catch up because most of them had gone out of business. And then by the time the boom came, there wasn't, it takes like 10 years for a builder to secure land and the permits and, do
10 years, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So they were lagging behind. And then the pandemic hit and the cost of lumber, went through the roof, and it became impossible to build a house at a profit. So builders have been stuck. And the other issue facing builders is the fact that in the city centers, and we'll take Washington, D.C. metropolitan area as a perfect example for this.
Yeah.
And we can take Southern Maryland specifically, or even Calvert County where I'm sitting. They have made the rules in order to build new construction so stringent that it is all the builders have left Calvert County. Like there is no new construction signs in Calvert County at all. And if you do a Google Earth map of Calvert County, it is trees on trees on trees. And we are like within 1 hour of Washington, D.C. There's no reason why there's not more houses here other than all of these municipalities or, local governments have restricted the ability for new construction. And part of that is because they need to build schools. They need to have the roads, and a lot of these like are well-established areas. Washington, D.C. has been here for hundreds of years, and they have the certain infrastructure in place. It's not easy to scale that up. You can't build new roads and without plowing down somebody's house in order to do it. It's very expensive. So my theory is that because there's no new construction, and because even if they wanted to, they couldn't build. Even if they could build, they won't be building $400,000 houses. They're building $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 houses. This pressure on this market is not going away. There will be no crash, and housing will stay expensive, however you want to define that, for the long term, at least the midterm.
So to me, I think housing is cheap.
Well, let's talk about this theory that I just put forth, though. Tell me if you agree with what I said. Was I wrong about that assumption?
No, I think you're right. I think you're right on the assumption. The cost to buy brand new is just like buying a new car, Brian. You're going to buy premium. There's no question about it, right?
But what about the sort of progression of time and the series of events that I described? Is that realistic? Is that the reason why they're not building houses? Is that the reason why? House prices haven't come down is because the other thing I didn't mention was, so now there's a backlog of people. So normally, the population gets bigger, the number of houses get bigger. Look in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, like the number of houses being built every year was however much it was. It was a lot. It kept up with the population growth. Now the population growth is getting bigger, but the number of houses is staying the same. That's part of what's driving house prices.
It is, and on the other side of the coin, it's also that your folks that are in their 60s are not selling their houses right now, right? I mean, let's face it, the rates are in the twos, and they're holding on to their homes longer. So I think
that's another big one. That's another big one,
man. I mean, it really is. So,
but my point was that could be resolved with interest rates going down. And my point is that there will be no ultimate, because when interest rates go down, house prices go up. So what I'm saying is that the relief valve, the only thing that will ultimately, allow for relief is the increase of supply.
Which I think you'll see a lot more homes coming on the market if the interest rates come down.
Yes, but it's a zero-sum game because those people turn around and buy a house.
Yeah, they do, but on the other side of the coin, they maybe not buy a home. Maybe they move into like a retirement community or something smaller along those lines, Brian. I mean, that's they're staying up here right now in the job sectors, I mean, the job centers, if you will, from that standpoint. Well, when they get to a point where it's affordable, again, interest rates, right, to move down to the retirement centers, South Carolina.
So that is where new construction is actually taking place. It's Florida and South Carolina, but the Washington D.C. area is not building new houses,
and they're not building affordable new houses. Let's call it that.
Well, okay, but even the ones, even if you drive through, even Charles, PG, all these areas, there's not a plethora of new houses to buy.
No, I mean, you see what's going on, Brian. I mean, there's only so much you can build too. There's only so much land. At some point in time, all the land's going to be used up. And so you decide you want to be like Calvert County and be a protectionist and try to retain that rural culture, that rural area.
Well, that's taking place everywhere. Even in the more built up areas, they still have made housing restrictions so intense. Part of that is, because they don't want septic tanks, they want sewers, and sewers cost $2 million for the smallest one you can build for a sewage treatment plant.
I think you're going to see a massive change in the type of housing that's out there. And I think you're going to see a massive change in the number of units that can be on a lot. We talk about, those tiny homes. I think you're going to see a lot more
Well, let's talk about that real quick. So the number of houses that can be built on a lot. So if you're familiar with the Solomon's Island Holiday Inn, you ever been there?
I have been there. It's not Solomon's Island Holiday Inn anymore, though, is it?
It's nothing. So it was legitimately a miniature resort. It was a really, really nice,
It was nice.
comparable to what else is around here. It was by far and away the nicest little hotel. So that guy sold it to a retirement conglomerate who then the project went defunct, and either they went out of business or the project went out of business, and it's currently sitting vacant. So the guy that sold it decided he would agree to buy it back, and he would put half of the building, turn it into condominiums, and the other half of the building would stay a retirement home. And in order to do that, they had to change the local ordinances that allowed for a higher population density. And every single county commissioner said, I was voted here in order to maintain a rural area. I will never vote for anything that allows for higher population density areas in Calvert County, period. End of story.
Wow. Okay. So in essence, we have to turn it back to a hotel.
No, it's sitting vacant. The guy said, "Oh, I'm not. You can't do anything. Whatever it is, it's gonna rot. Like it's sitting there growing, is overgrowing at the moment." But my point is that the local county executives have an opinion here, there, and just about everywhere. Not in my backyard. I don't want, these high density. Because it represents crime, it represents low-income housing, it represents, a degradation of lifestyle. That's what this is really all about. And it also represents congestion. We have the third worst traffic in the whole country here. So there's arguments to be made on both sides. I can understand why they would say that. However, from a housing market perspective, what the housing market ultimately needs is $400,000 and $300,000 single family homes for people to live in. There's nothing on the horizon that says that's coming.
Yeah, I think there is. So I think what's going to happen is you're going to see a number of housing units that are currently being used as Airbnb are going to be released back into the marketplace.
I think that the number was 1 million Airbnbs, and if 30% of them go back on the market, that's 300,000. That's not going to change the big picture.
But it's one part of the puzzle, Brian. You're going to have that. You've got a lot of homes that are still owned by Fannie and Freddie that are being released back in the marketplace. I saw one today, as a matter of fact, in Indian Head. I mean, you and I saw that house earlier. That's owned by Fannie Mae. I mean, that property is going back in the marketplace to be sold. So you're going to see a lot of houses coming back on the market that were rentals back into the mainstream. You're going to see Airbnb coming back into the mainstream. You're going to see builders bringing houses into the mainstream. You're going to see people buying homes that need a lot of tender love and care, realizing, you know what, I was looking for this type of home, but I can buy this house and I can renovate it, or I can restructure it, or I can reposition the home. I've got one client right now, literally owns a mobile home. He's buying a small house, right, on a nice piece of land, and he's going to tear the house down and put his home there. I think.
So all of those things you described, only one of them added, because even the Fannie Mae, somebody was living in it before then. The Airbnbs, somebody was not really living in it, but the rentals, the rentals that are going for sale, somebody lived in. The foreclosures that are coming up, somebody lived in them.
Right.
It's still a zero-sum game. The only thing that really adds true relief is, the number of houses that can be purchased has to increase, or the number of people trying to buy houses has to decrease. I don't see that happening.
No.
Until the scenario in which the number of human beings living in America starts to finally catch up with the decline, which is like 20, 30 years from now. So I'm thinking 10 years, 20 years, there's going to be pressure on the housing market because the demand is 6 million human beings want to live in a house that don't want to, that aren't buying one today.
So if I can throw another angle to you, though, Brian, I mean, at the same time, and I think they're going to change some of the housing permit some of the housing laws to allow you to put on second units properties, to allow you to take houses and subdivide them. I think you're going to see a lot more changes along those lines.
But what I just described, I think Calvert County in particular, I don't know as much about Charles County, and I don't know about Prince George's County, but the will of the government is against this idea. Like in Calvert, so as an example, if you wanted to build an apartment above your garage,
right,
they're going to make you dig a new septic tank because your house was built with a certain square footage based on a certain number of bedrooms for that particular septic tank, which, by the way, has increased in size like double. So even if you had an extra large septic tank bigger than your regular house 20 years ago, it's still too small today.
correct.
So you're going to have to dig a new septic tank. That's $30,000. You have to pay an impact fee of $8,000 or $10,000 just to get permission to do it. That's a tax. That's in order to be able to rent out your garage apartment.
Do you have to pay the impact fee just to expand that, Brian?
Yeah, because you're basically adding a household to the school system. The impact fee represents adding to the school system. So you're adding another family onto your property. You have to pay the fee.
Well, it's cost of living. I mean, let's just call it what it is, right?
Yeah, but my point is that you could make the argument that the will, if they wanted to, they could incentivize it. They could say, hey, you can use your existing septic tank as long as you're not adding more than 1,000 square feet and there's no impact fee. And if you wanted to, you can build two structures as long as you have 3 acres. Like that would be a huge relief, but there's no will to do that. That's my point.
I think it's going to have to happen. I think it's going to come down the pike. I'll be honest with you. Maybe no will to want to make it happen. It just has to happen. Otherwise, you're going to have people that are homeless. You have people that are doubling up. I mean, let's face it, Brian. They're already, mom and dad, and then their 2 kids, their families.
Yeah.
They're already living in the house as it is.
Yes,
right? We're not really.
Yeah, we're moving back into a multi-generational, living structure. I see that quite a bit. That's definitely true. But I don't think that we're near a place where the will is there. The will is not. The will is on the opposite end of the spectrum. In order to get it on the other side of the line where they're going to approve some of this stuff, there has to be an enormous amount of pressure. And I don't see that happening soon. So I'm seeing like 5 years minimum. This pressure is going to be there.
So what that says to me that now is a great time to buy a home then, right? I mean, you got to look at it from that perspective.
Yeah. I mean, I outside, I'm just strictly speaking to this sort of idea everybody has in the back of their mind is like something has to give. There's going to be a crash. Like when I read the comments I read a lot of articles and the comments are always, oh, it's getting ready to crash. And they've been saying that for like 10 years because how like the housing market goes up and down every 5 years. It went up for like 14 years straight, and then it just went up like that. And everyone's like, well, it has to crash. It doesn't have to crash.
Doesn't at all, man. It is actually kind of crazy. I mean, if you see the Maryland Association of Realtors and see their items, dude, values are still going up.
They are.
You know what I mean? It is nuts. It really is. So, everybody says it has to crash. I don't think it's got to crash per se. I think realistically what's going to have to happen is we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to pivot, right? That's all it comes down to. We're going to pivot and turn. It's going to happen. Not a big deal. We move on.
When you say pivot, I'm going to interpret that to mean homeowners are going to have to accept less than what their ideal was.
Yeah, I think we're going to be more realistic about, do we really need a 3,000 square foot home? Do we really need to have 15 bedrooms? Do you really need to live in the size of a house that you're living at today? I mean, I hate to say it, but that's really the truth, right? That's what it comes down to. And then are we maximizing the utilization of our space? I mean, look, it throws me off a little bit. Calvert County, bring Calvert County up. They just prevented one of their campgrounds. I don't know if you saw that or not. They changed it from a all year long campground, right, to only seasonal. So you can't live in it. Yeah, you can't live in it long term.
Well, it wasn't year round. What they had was permanent sites. It was like 2/3 or 3/4 of it was that. And then they made it so that it's all, and the thing was they only had like 5 sites that you could rent. And then it was like 30 sites where people basically had first right of refusal, and they would stay there for like 20 years. So they had their camper parked on the edge of the beach, and they were paying $3,500 a year, and they were staying there. So they did away with it. So I think that kind of made sense from giving access to more people to be able to go, use the beach instead of restricting it to just
What about
20
the people that
families.
lived there year round though? That was their home.
They didn't though. They didn't. That wasn't those. What that was is people that had sort of owned the right to this particular campsite for like 20 years, so they never moved their camper, but they weren't allowed to live there in the wintertime. It's only from like May till like October. It shuts down in the winter.
Gotcha. So it really wasn't resolved. Well, ultimately, Brian, if we're saying we're going to see a crash, and I see that the average sale price in Calvert County and for November went up 9%, 9.1%. St. Mary's County went up 13.1%.
We got a comment on here from Next Level Home Inspection. Says there won't be a crash. Interest rates will come down, but home values will rise. Buy now if you can and save. That's definitely what we've been saying. I mean, that's ultimately the truth is, and I'm not trying to be negative here. I think to Tim's point, I'm just trying to make the argument of why. I'm not making the argument not to buy a house. Like, I think to Tim's point, it is still the appropriate thing to do most of the time to buy a house, because you're locking in your payment, you're locking in the equity, you're locking in your ability to, grow that house value over time. It's very hard to make an argument that waiting is going to be better, right?
I saw a really good article the other day, and it said that the annualized return on rent. What's the annualized return on rent?
I don't know.
0, right? Think about it. You don't make any money, right? I mean, you're renting.
Well, okay, let's make this argument though. You could rent a house for $2,000 a month. It would cost you $3,500 a month to purchase. So if you took the $1,500 and put $17,000 in the bank every year for a couple years, that's your return.
And let me put it this way: and that rent is not going to be $2,000 for 30 years.
No, you're right about that.
30 years, it's going to be $5,000-$6,000. Okay. So the true answer is renting is more expensive than owning, because the end of 30 years, you own that house free and clear. It's a savings account. At the end of 30 years, you're still paying rent at $6,000 versus at $2,000. Brian, hands down.
You're right, Tim. Long term, yes. Short term, if you're going to be in this area for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, then I would say it becomes a wash, because you're not going to make a lot of money selling your house.
Calvert County, 9.1% increase average sale price in November. I'm just saying.
From what, the year before?
The year before.
I would say we need to look at Maryland, because that's probably like.
Maryland went up 4.5 average sale price. Median price went up 6.7.
So that's it, guys. I mean, the fact of the matter is, as much as we all hate it, and as much as we would love to just close your eyes and say it's not true, it's not happening, house prices are going up.
So buy now.
Yep.
Don't wait.
Yep.
That's
all right, Tim.
All right, brother.
Good call, man.